The bandwidth for this episode of the Power Factor Show is brought to you by the Firearms Radio Network. Firearmsradio.tv.
Sponsored by Taylor Freelance, Rainier Ballistics, Hodgdon Powders, and JPL Precision.
Okay, Power Factor fans, we've been getting quite a few questions lately. Some of them are fairly general interest, and as you well know, we do the occasional Reader's Right episode or segment. So I'm just going to do a few question and answers here, stuff that the viewers sent in that maybe is of a little more general interest than to just the one person who submitted the question. Hey, Power Factor fans, can I ask some questions? No. Okay, here we go. Question one. This is from Nathan. Nathan's question is, this is a USPSA question. It was kind of interesting. I hadn't really considered it. The USPSA rules specify that the butt of the gun, specifically the grip of the gun, can be no more than 2 inches away from the inside of your belt. So Nathan asked, how do you measure if the grip is not directly opposite the mounting point? And when you think about it, holsters are not mounted to the belt on a point, usually. As an example, my fancy new Ted Blocker Thunder, you can see that the belt mount is about 1.5 inches wide. So there is no single point where the holster attaches to the belt. And then if you've got your holster oriented so that the gun, say, is not vertical, but the butt is tilted to the rear, as is very commonly the case on a competition rig, if you're required by the rules to measure perpendicularly from your body, let's say you're wearing it at 3 o'clock, so you have to measure directly out perpendicular to the belt from the 3 o'clock position. What if the angle of the butt means that a straight line from the attachment point doesn't touch the butt of the gun? And where is the attachment point when the attachment is really 1.5 inches wide? Where on that 1.5 inches is your point? And then if you measure straight out and it doesn't contact the grip, do you change the angle? Are you allowed to change the angle when the rule says it must be perpendicular? If the grip is not perpendicular from the body straight out to the grip, do you just keep measuring until you touch some other part of the gun, which of course the rule doesn't specify either. And so my answer to Nathan specifically was, I can't say what NROI might decide is the correct answer. If I were writing the rules, I might say that a straight line between some point on the grip and the inside of the belt must be no more than 2 inches, but that's not what it says. It says a line perpendicular, straight out, can be no more than 2 inches between the inside of the inner belt, if you've got 2 belts on, and the grip. And apparently there's been some variation in how the rule's been enforced at different matches. And I'd say, write a letter to headquarters, send them an email, and ask them how exactly is this supposed to be measured when the holster, in fact, is not mounted to a point on the belt, and the grip may not be directly opposite this perpendicular line. Now we've got a question from, I'm going to pronounce it Mornay. I'm not really sure. M-O-R-N-E. You know who you are. The question is, first, they want to say how much he enjoys Power Factor Show. It's very informative and entertaining. That's, yeah. So the question is, I've recently joined South Africa's governing body for IDPA, which is SADPA. I'm going to guess that's South African Defensive Pistol Association. I've only shot a classifier, but had so much fun, I plan on getting my own firearm next year. They have licensing and whatnot. So his question is regarding the use of manual safeties in IDPA. I plan on getting a Glock pistol, but for interest's sake, here it goes. In stock service pistol, do you have to use the manual safety if your pistol, even if it's a double action pistol, features a manual safety? Now the question is different in different divisions. My answer to Mornay is that if a gun is legal for stock service pistol, then it is not required to have a manual safety. And if it does have a safety, the shooter has the option of engaging it or not. it's a little more complicated in enhanced service pistol. If it's a gun with a manual safety and the gun is single action, or it's a double action gun in single action mode, the manual safety must be engaged. So for instance, in stock service pistol, let's say if you've got a gun that gives you the option of hammer down or cocked and locked, and there's very few guns on the market that are like that, most prominently the CZ75 variations. If you're shooting your CZ75 in stock service pistol, you must start with the hammer down. Any gun that's got an external hammer in stock service pistol, the hammer must be down at the start. If it's got a manual safety, you have the option of on or off. In enhanced service pistol, if you're starting in double action mode, then you're in the same boat. If the hammer's down, safety on or off. But if that hammer is cocked, and it must have, essentially, if you've got a cocked hammer with a single action trigger, the gun has to have a manual safety. You cannot holster the gun with a cocked hammer and no manual safety engaged. Now, we're starting to get into some kind of gray areas with a lot of these striker fire pistols that really are not double action, and legally anyway, or in somebody's mind, they're not single action pistols, even though a short 3-pound pull is all that separates you from firing the gun. For some reason, striker fired guns get away from the rule requirement that says there must be a safety engaged. And of course, the theory behind the old double action and single action was that, well, the safety on a double action pistol is the long, heavy trigger pull, and that's why you don't need a manual safety on it. But of course, a striker fired Glock or M&P with a 2-pound trigger is much closer conceptually to a single action gun than a double action gun, but the rules have just kind of been blurred enough that any gun that doesn't have a hammer essentially doesn't need to have a safety. And the rules are confusing for that reason, because it's not a matter of how short or light is the trigger pull. It's more just a matter of, does the gun have a hammer? If the hammer's cocked, you got to have a safety. The safety must be engaged. If there's no hammer, whatever features the gun has are considered adequate for safety. And that's really what it comes down to. If you're trying to decide what is the start condition for this gun, it pretty much just comes down to the presence of a hammer. If the hammer's down, no safety. If the hammer's cocked, you must have the safety and it must be engaged. Now this is one that's fairly involved. This is a USPSA match situation where the shooter is described by the person submitting the question on a stage that was probably 35 yards in length from start to finish. Toward the end of the stage, there were 2 targets on the right side of the stage that needed to be shot before stepping up about 5 more yards to finish the stage, shooting 4 more targets through a port. So if you're imagining this, we've got shooting through a port. I was having issues this match with underpowered ammo, which put me shooting the 2 targets on the right side of the stage slightly out of position. So he admits to kind of not really being in the positions he wants to be in while engaging these targets. But after shooting and holstering, the RO with the shot timer said that was real close to breaking the 180. Now, it's interesting that when this question was submitted, one of the, I don't know if it was Steve or Larry, commented, oftentimes when the range officer says that was really close to the 180, what they really mean is, I just let you get away with one because you were really close to the line. I mean, that's essentially what they're saying. It's kind of a veiled warning that you were either right at or even a little bit beyond the line, but I'm just going to let you go with a warning. That's what it amounts to. I agreed and I said, I know, that was close. I've been there. That's why I'm not acting. That was close. Does that sound convincing? The CRO was standing about 35 to 40 yards at the start of the stage. So while the shooter and the guy, I call him the guy with the timer, are 35 yards up range, the CRO is back at the start position, and he comes running up and says he is DQ'd. I asked why, and he said that I'd broken the 180 on one of the targets on the right. If I did, I deserved a DQ, and that's the proper attitude to have. If somebody says you broke the 180, if I did, yeah, I'm DQ'd. But when you have the guy with the timer and the scorekeeper standing right on top of you while you're shooting, and neither one of them disqualifies you, and then some guy who's 30 yards away comes running up and DQs you, is there an issue with that? And he says he called for the range master, which is the right move. You want to appeal the decision to discuss the DQ. They went back and forth, and ultimately the shooter was disqualified. And he said, you know, what's the deal there? And his question really was, should some guy who's 35 yards away be making a call or overruling a call when two other range officers, whose job it is to be looking for this very thing, decide not to call it? And my comment was, you're correct that when you have two people right on top of you who don't make a call and somebody comes running up from left field and overrules, I'd say there's an issue there. Well, you know, regardless of what you did, this person, especially now, it turns out when I first read the question, it hadn't been established that this person that came running up wasn't just a random range officer who happened to be observing. Under those conditions, I'd say this person has no responsibilities whatsoever other than kind of general safety. The idea that because I'm a range officer, anytime I see an infraction, it's my job to jump in and make the call. That's definitely not the case. When you're not actually working as a staff member on that stage, if you're a range officer, you have no responsibilities beyond just kind of general safety. You should not be injecting your opinion into rulings made by the people whose job it is to make those rulings. But now, if the people who are downrange are working the stage, they're match staff, and the person who's uprange is also the match staff, they all have joint responsibility for making all of the calls, scoring calls, safety calls. But I still think, again, I mean, it's like if you're a fan of football and you're watching a game and there's a play, let's say in the corner of the end zone, and the referee right there in the corner makes one call, and then another referee comes running over from the other side of the field and wants to overturn his call, don't you think, what is that guy doing? You know, he didn't have a very good view of it. What is he doing, you know, stinking his nose here, when the guy that's right on top of the play, even if the guy that's across the way is the head of the officiating crew kind of a position, the guy who's right on top of the play is the guy who has the responsibility to make the call. And so ultimately what it comes down to is, if it's been determined that you're disqualified, you're disqualified. I mean, that's the end of it. You know, even if you think it was done so wrongly, if this person who made the call is on duty and it's his job to make scoring calls and the range master agrees with them, all you can do is just graciously accept that you're disqualified. But I think the shooter certainly is should be on top of things enough that when they think the call has been made in error, call the range master over. I mean, that's his job. If it's an IDPA match, call the match director over. Have your story heard by the people in authority and at least get your side of the story in. But essentially what it comes down to is just like in any other sporting event. I mean, I think it's very interesting that I hear people complaining about the subjectivity of some rules interpretations. And if you're a fan of, say, baseball, every time a pitch is thrown, it's a subjective call whether it was a ball or a strike. And people just accept that when humans are making the call, it's not perfect. It is what it is. It's always the same. That's the best you can hope for, is the person who's making the call gives everybody the same call. And there's no homer calls. There's no this guy's from out of town calls. There's no I hate your shirt calls. Everybody gets the same treatment. But even if you disagree with the call, just accept it, be gracious, and if it was a safety issue and you did break the 180, just be really conscious of where you are on the range. Don't get yourself in those positions. I always say, don't put it in the hands of the range officer or safety officer. Because if you put it in their hands, sometimes you're going to get the call that you like and sometimes you're not. But if you always keep yourself on the correct side of safety, you're never going to get that call. Okay, this question is a follow-up to the episode I did on loading, hand loading near maximum pressure. And the question comes from actually a guy named Rick, believe it or not. And he said, he said, I never understood pressure signs. And he's sort of thinking, so how come I've got a gun like a 45 auto and I'm looking for pressure signs at 20,000 PSI, and I've got a 9mm and I'm looking for those same pressure signs at 35,000 PSI, or I've got a 9x23 Winchester and I'm looking for pressure signs at 45,000 PSI. How come those pressure signs appear at different pressure levels? And it's something that I did not really have a definitive answer for. I'm not a metallurgist. I'm not that technical. I'm not an engineer. But the answer that I came up with is that you're reaching the pressure limit for the design of a given cartridge. The cartridge, either the thickness of the metal, the hardness of the metal, the composition of the metal are designed for a certain cartridge to contain a certain amount of pressure. And when you start getting up near the limit for that cartridge, you start seeing those pressure signs. And I made a point that you can't always tell from a given pressure sign that there's a problem. For instance, I mentioned flattened primers, cratered primers, bulges in the case wall. Some or all of those can be pressure signs, but for instance, the bulge in the case wall, that could be an issue with the chamber, so offering insufficient chamber support for the chambered cartridge. So the problem isn't necessarily the cartridge, the problem is with the gun giving you a false pressure sign, and it's still dangerous because a bulging cartridge is dangerous. But the reason it's bulging is not because you're reaching the pressure limit, but because the way the gun has been built, it's not able to allow you to safely reach that limit. So you have to kind of compare your signs. And I always think also trust how the gun feels. If you're loading, major power factor loads, you're switching bullets or switching powders, and the gun seems to be recoiling really sharply compared to what you're used to, it's probably a more powerful load. And if you're feeling that sharp recoil, the cases are ejecting 15 feet, you're seeing the case bulge, you're right near the limit. I mean, those are legitimate warning signs. So don't disregard any one, but generally you can't tell if one is an actual pressure problem or if it's a sign of something that's not related to the pressures being too high. So that's my answer. For a given cartridge, the pressure signs will appear when that cartridge is reaching its limit. So that's it for questions for today. But if you have a question, go ahead and fire them off. I mean, we've got Larry is our weekly USPSA shooter. Steve and John are doing the shotguns. Doug's doing the 3-gun. We can handle just about anything, whether it's gun issues. If you got a gunsmithing question, John's your man. If it's something about rules, USPSA rules, IDPA rules, 3-gun rules, we're all range officers, safety officers. We're on top of that too. So just fire the questions to us. We love to hear from our viewers, and send those into powerfactorshow@gmail.com.